Call this meeting, the subcommittee of boards, commissions, and committees to order. To a roll call real quick. Alder Rebecca Kimball.
Here.
John Rothschild.
Here.
Mark Gumchurch, absent. Maggie Northrop is also absent. So I know it's a quick turn, but if we could take a look at the minutes from our previous meeting. If anyone has any questions or anything else, otherwise we will entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
Where we have a second. Any further discussion on these minutes? Hearing none, all those approved and all those in favor of approving these minutes from February 5th, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any opposition? That motion passes. Sir, is there any public comment today?
No.
There's no public comment. And disclosures.
Suspension of the rules to allow for free-flowing public comment.
Is there a motion? Suspending Robert's rules. Second. Any further discussion? All those approved, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing no oppositions, that motion passes. Welcomes to our guests here. They're welcome to come to the table. We have suspended Robert's rules, so if you'd like to join the conversation or just come to be closer to us. Meeting this sandwich, forgive me, has onions, so maybe sit by them. All right, any disclosures or recusals at this time? No disclosures or recusals. We are going to move right into agenda item 5. We do want to be judicious about our time. We have a lot to go through to finish conversation, and we're still on the appointments. So we discussed, just take a look at our minutes. We went through this. I guess we haven't. We did not have the luxury of really putting together as thorough a diagnostics tool as we did for our midterm report on BCCs. So it's a little bit harder for us to actually come up with an alternative form and then score it, if you will, against the diagnostics that we came up with. So we did identify some of these things. So I wish our esteemed Alder from the 15th district was here, because he seems to be very interested in this topic. But
Yeah, didn't he say last night or Wednesday night that he was going to come with his written proposal?
yeah, maybe he's on his way.
That he did this analysis of breaking out the different boards, commissions, and committees around legislative function and, right. That would be extremely helpful. I was very interested in what he had to say about that.
Maybe you meant the next Tfogs meeting.
Well, we have that. I have it written down. We can kind of go through that, I think, and think about that. But I think if we just talked about, we kind of went through the way that it exists right now and the way that people are appointed to our boards, commissions, and committees as it stands with the mayor, the mayor's office initiating the appointments, and then you're referring to the common council. Aside from what we already have, and our guests can take a look at the minutes, I think it's pretty thorough. Sir, welcome.
Hi.
We have suspended Robert's rules, so please
Fantastic.
join us. You're eating a sandwich, so join us frequently, so I don't have to talk about it.
Just next time, bring.
Oh, I would have. I'm not going on Italian beef, trust me, you want to try it. We on the minutes, we went through just kind of on the minutes that had from the 5th, we went through, in essence, a very, I think, expedited conversation of the way that appointments work right now. We've talked about some of the challenges. At this time, we want to make sure that we spend a lot of time going through this today, so I don't know if it's the right time to talk about alternative ways to do this and then to kind of hold it up against the things that we lifted up as being the challenges with the current system, to see if any alternative proposals would alleviate or mitigate the challenges that we identified. Or if anyone in the committee has any, or anyone in the room has any other suggestions as to how we could keep moving on this so that we can.
What was I remember, I think Rebecca made some negatives, but let's just say, talk about the proposal of splitting the two, allowing the mayor to make all the resident appointments, and the council, be it either the council president or the CCEC, CCEC, making all of the alder appointments to the committees. Now, if we did a reorganization, that might change, because there wouldn't be as many to do, right? I mean, if we do, you know, kind of the idea that came across from either from the city attorney's proposal or the proposal that I drew up, where we wouldn't have alders on anywhere nearly as many committees, maybe a different process is appropriate. But if it stays the way it is, what did you see was wrong with that, Rebecca?
I saw what was wrong with that, especially if it was president making all alder appointments, and there is a conflictual relationship between the person of the president and the person of the mayor's office, that a really dysfunctional committee might be created by the mayor putting people ideologically aligned with the mayor on it, and the president putting people ideologically aligned with the president on it, and that it wouldn't really be checks and balances, it would just be end up in a dysfunctional committee.
Even though we've kind of identified that there's not very much turnover in residents on it, it's finding new residents that's the big function, right?
Yeah, even though, I would say, because there is turnover, I mean, certainly within the mayor's term, because the longest resident term is 3 years, I think, on a committee, is that right?
Is that right?
So,
Oh,
yeah.
I thought it was one.
Yeah, no, there's
Really?
always turnover.
Oh, the term is over, but the people stay the same.
Sometimes,
I mean, you can.
yeah, they can,
There's no limit. I mean,
12
was it
years is
12
the-
years?
12 years.
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
but the
12-year
term
limit.
is 3 years, so potentially there's turnover.
Okay.
Now, I think that's somewhat mitigated if we're talking about the CCEC making the appointments, a larger group of people, leadership in the council making the appointments, which I think is an interesting idea we should discuss more. But I think backing up, Mike May brought up a point that I feel like we should discuss and do some analysis on, which is some committees are more specifically legislative. Some are more sort of management / operational. And would it make sense for the CCEC or the council to have a greater hand in the legislative committee appointments and the executive to have a greater hand in the operational / administrative? So I feel like there's some analysis we can do around that.
Sort of in the one of the two alternatives that we put together, the one with only 3 columns, where we split that up into those, what we thought those 2 categories would be. So under finance was the more administrative ones, and under CCE were the ones that we thought were more policy focused, so that you could kind of take a look at those and have this discussion around that.
And
Do you
those are
remember
in
the,
that big document dump on that.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you, but off the top of your head, sir, do you happen to remember this?
It's right here. I could go make a quick copy of this if you want. That would be easiest. I can't remember exactly what day it was.
What date did you have?
It was,
But it should be in the,
It's on the legislature.
I can,
Yeah. I don't think I brought my iPad.
this should.
Quick recess.
This structure here raises this issue, is do we want to have the top committees be all alders? Because these are all alder committees, at least as they exist now, right?
Well, and again, the columns were, I mean, that's one issue. The columns were sort of, we were trying to figure out a way to separate administrative related
yeah.
things from
Right.
legislative ones, so that was part of that.
And then the other part of that is, do you want to organize by type of function or by subject matter that they deal with?
Right, and that was actually the other
Right,
one.
the alternate,
Yeah.
yes,
This was the subject matter one,
right.
Yeah.
which I did not make copies.
And that's
Which are,
kind of what
it's online.
doing the best I could, that's what that was the
Yeah,
area
this is,
that I worked under.
it's similar, this is almost like a vertical representation of what you
Yeah.
had. I mean, if
Yeah.
you can put it like
Yes.
this.
Yeah.
Really, the only thing different between this one and the one that John did was that John's required us to create some new other committees that didn't already exist. And we just tried to use ones that already existed, because like, we didn't think that you could create a parks, overseeing parks committee that would then have somehow have jurisdiction over the board.
No, I think that was a mistake I made. I was making the parks, I think I wanted to put the parks board on the
Anyway,
top.
yeah, so
Yeah,
that-
but
that
anyway, that was, but the reason that I didn't do what you did is because I had come to the conclusion that I was in favor of having all their committees being mother committees. I put those off to the side, doing the function they do today without supervising committees.
And the only reason we put the column with the common council was those are those sort of required quasi-judicial ones. It is really just a placeholder. It's not so much that they would report to the common council, although some of their decisions do get appealed there.
And, yeah, and that was I did try to do the same thing, but by the arrow that went up and then it went into the common council. So basically, yeah.
Am I missing, where's the Transportation Commission and the TPPB?
It should be under,
Eliminated.
no, is it not on there?
It's not, I don't, maybe I'm blind,
We have the
but
long-range planning subcommittee on the finance column.
Yeah, pending oversight in there.
That's probably done right during the transition.
No.
No.
Of all the ones that leave off, I can't believe I don't know.
I know, those are your babies, John.
Anyway, so,
Where would they fit
well, I think the
conceptually?
TPPB would fit under the CCEC, and I think Transportation Commission would fit under
Finance.
Finance, yeah. They're on this one.
Mhm.
TPPB is a mother committee on this organization. And the other thing I would just say is that when I looked at other cities way early on in this process, a lot of their city websites have it very clearly delineated that they have mayoral committees and they have legislative committees. So they have actually separate sections of their website, different kinds of committees. And I didn't look deep enough to see exactly how all these appointments go, but clearly there are some cities that already make this distinction between the types of committees that there are.
Can you recall off the top of your head which one?
No, but I think I probably have it somewhere. in
Yeah,
my-
in a spreadsheet,
Yeah.
a massive spreadsheet somewhere.
So a question I would have, I mean, I made that comment, you know, the old thing, why would I give up one king 10,000 miles away for 10,000 kings 1 mile away? So a lot of the challenges that we're seeing that we've talked about is an imbalance of power and how that shows up in terms of how appointments, I don't know the answer to this, but I'd be curious to the folks that have more familiarity with the common council, that if we made it heavier for a common council leadership to have the appointment authority, do we really think that that would go away? Do we think that that would mitigate this imbalance? Because to me, it would just, I mean, I don't know that one human over another is more susceptible to the allure of trying
Right,
to.
that was my point about CCEC. If CCEC collectively did it, that might mitigate it a little bit, but not if it was just the president. I think it would be really dysfunctional if it was just the president.
I thought that if we did a limit on the number of committees that an alder could serve on at any one, at any one time, that would force a distribution of the workload of alders onto more
Yeah.
alders on the council. Now, you might not get what some perceive as the best appointment, you don't get on finance, but they get on several others and be expected to serve.
Yeah, that limiting
Yeah.
would mitigate it, but that
Yeah.
doesn't address the question of who does the appointing. But that, I think that
Yeah.
is a good point.
Yeah, but in terms of, do you get the feeling that if a particular mayor appoints a citizen to a committee, that that person really carries the weight of the mayor to that committee meeting?
In a way,
Do they?
indirectly, yeah. Especially depending on what committee it is.
Mm.
Plan commission.
Plan commission, police and fire commission, definitely,
Okay.
yeah.
I think you also have to watch like the number of committees. Some districts have a whole bunch of committees that are like, you're just there because you're from that district. And so those districts, if you limited the number, they could only serve the things that serve their district, and they wouldn't be able to be working on citywide issues as much. Like, I was on the State Street Oversight Committee because I was an alder from District 2. State Street wasn't in my district, but for some reason, that's what Warren Onken said. And so I was on that committee, and I had to be on that committee, which then limited the time that I could spend on other issues. So I think that you'd have to look at like, again, maybe like different classifications, like policy committees versus like
Oversight.
project committees or something.
If we move more towards Justice's idea of task force and limited term for committees, sunset provisions, that part of that might be eliminated.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how you do the thing where you limit the number of committees alders serve on without reducing. I feel like the reduction of
Yeah.
committees, the question that we seem to run into is this thing about how do we do that?
Well, what my thought was, is they
John
don't
has
serve
this
on any committees, you know, except the so-called mother committees. They're not on there, they can go to them, and they can be there, they can talk, because they all have the right to do that, but they don't count for one.
Sir.
I thought you were going down the ad hoc lane,
Mhm.
but just point out that we did put one of the footnotes here is that to actually write an ordinance, number 4, that talks about the creation of ad hoc committees and creates a more rigorous standard for creating them, and then requirements for what, if it's done by resolution, what has to be in that resolution to make sure that they know what they're doing, and that there's a definite time for expiration of that ad hoc committee.
So you're telling me,
That would be one of the, but then you started talking about, so I raised my hand a little quickly.
well, no, I mean, that's helpful. The transportation committees, for instance, I have always been trained to understand them as part of housing and economic development, to understand transit that way. I don't know how it exists as something other than that, and I think a challenge that we have here, I feel like that would fall under housing, community, and economic development. That's where all those things should be addressed, and they should, that committee should be creating transportation committees specifically to address challenges that we have within housing, community, and economic development, and they should have deliberate deliverables, timelines, and accountability or parameters that are given to them so that they are not, they not standing committees, and if that they review. It's just an example because I've thought a lot about the question about which ones you get rid of, and it's not to say that the function, oversight, or purpose of them go away, or that it's just saying that those responsibilities would fall under one of the other committees that remain standing, and then they would have to, as a part of a review process that we talked about, have to establish these things periodically, bring people in, and then address whatever, go through that business, and then come back and then make recommendations accordingly, right? And so it doesn't mean that you would need these things to be permanent and standing all the time. You would still have that same responsibility within the larger committees, and they would have to come back and do it. But again, I don't know how we, I don't know. Anyone, I mean,
Is your question, how do we
Well,
limit
this-
certain ones to just alders? or-
How do we keep them focused on the work they need to be doing in a coherent way with the, overall city policy, right?
Right, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And, but another thing is, I don't know the answer to.
I'm sorry, that guy just looks familiar.
What's up, man?
Tony,
I know. I
Nice
saw
to see you.
What's up? Come on in.
no, I can't. I'm on my way to pick up the 4-year-old from daycare and gotta go by the
It's good to
DMV.
see you. Shoot me
I'll
a
give you a
note, man.
ring.
All right, do it.
All right.
It's good to see you. Long time. My good friend. I grew up with him.
Oh,
You guys probably know his kid, Tony Robinson.
oh,
But anyway, Terrell. It's a long time, man. Oh. Anyway, that threw me off. The question here is how we, so the number of things, so if hypothetically we were to reduce the size of the council, there's no way to do that without, to have representation without significantly reducing the number of committees. Those two things would go hand in hand as it stands, because one of the big things that that's been brought up is that the number of committees that our alders are asked to serve on makes it very challenging for them to do the legislative work to support those committees and while also doing the work that they need to be doing as alders, right?
So
those
would that
things.
make it small enough to drown in a bathtub? Sorry. I mean, but that's what you're talking about. I mean, that is the effect of what you're talking about. Reducing the size of the council, slashing the number of committees.
I think, but if you had them as full, I mean, again, hypothetically, if you had them as full-time or a significant amount of them as full-time and you extend their terms, I don't know that you could drown them in a bathtub at that point, right? Because what you're doing is you're actually allowing them more bandwidth to do more substantive work. Where, if you have a bunch of folks that you're stretching.
But allowing for different influences to influence that work.
Hypothetically.
Influences on one side and fewer influences on another side.
but if you had, let's say, 7 or 8 mother committees, and that's the only thing that the alders had to serve on, and they would only serve on, say, no more than 3 of those, or 2, whatever we decide is appropriate based on the number of alders there are, then you have cut their demand for their time
Yeah.
significantly. And in return for that, the responsibility of those mother committees would be to make sure that all the subcommittees underneath that were doing their work. And I would see that goes into Rebecca's agency. They do the legwork on that to make sure and give reports on what they're doing. And if they want to eliminate one, they come back to the council and say they're not necessary. So I see it working really well with Rebecca's proposal and just, saving the alders from themselves. It's keep them from being on all these committees. When they're really, our feedback has been they don't really feel they serve a whole lot of function.
When we
They just
address-
take up time.
Because what Roger Goodwin said at the full task force meeting, I thought that narrative of the meandering
Mission creep.
was very fitting, and I think it applied to the committees as much as it does the
We definitely have a
departments.
flatline organization of committees.
Well, so everything that we've looked at, when we've looked across the United States, there's no examples of, the idea that having more alders is not necessarily, we're showing that it does not mean anything about representation necessarily. We understand that it could potentially mean something about it, but it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean anything, it doesn't say anything about equity, we know that. It doesn't say anything about efficiency or effectiveness. And so, I would see the point that smaller councils also, we looked at San Diego. San Diego has 8. For a city of 1.7 million people, they have 8 city council, they have 8 city council members, right? As someone who was involved in, at the time, critical politics in San Diego, I said a lot of people there would say it has a lot of challenges also, right? There's a lot of things, it turns out that a lot of the things that we see as being some of the pressing challenges we have in Madison, Wisconsin, a lot of cities are dealing with those right now all over the place. And I don't know that, to the point is I don't know that the larger council versus a smaller council, in terms of a number of these things, of interests and all these things, one or the other it means that it will be better or worse. So having a large council or a smaller, there's nothing that we've seen or looked at that suggested that it's better to have a big one. We just like it because that's the way we have it now, and that's what I'm saying, is that I think...
We're smaller than Chicago's. 52, or whatever they have in
Yeah.
Chicago.
Yeah, for 4 million people.
Yeah. Yeah,
I mean, we're half of that, and we
Right.
have 258,000 people.
yeah.
So like, yeah, right, I mean, I hope we're smaller than Chicago's, you know, I don't know that 8 is enough for, like I said, the challenges that they have, everything that we've heard about the challenges with interest and the way that this stuff works is a challenge in some of these places that have full-time smaller councils, we've established that, right? I'm just saying that because there's a number of hypotheticals that are always thrown out, straw dog arguments about why having a smaller council or why going to at-large districts could potentially do all these other things. And I don't know what, that's true. Maybe a meteor will hit the earth. I mean, there's no way to,
Well, but no, if you have to win a vote by 11 votes as opposed to winning a vote by 4 votes, that's de facto, you know, you have to be more deliberate in consensus building in a bigger body, basically. You have to be more deliberate and more, there has to be more democratic process in a bigger body than there is in a smaller body, just to be able to get things done.
so be that as, okay, so I understand as a rhetorical device. I would say that it's a percentage thing though, right? So if you still need a certain percentage of the council to vote on it, it doesn't change it. Now, all I'll say is that historically that has done nothing to address systemic inequities in Madison, Wisconsin. Having this big thing and consensus building has done nothing. It's done nothing to address it. So like,
But that's not the problem of the size of the council.
not alone, I agree.
No.
I mean, I agree.
That's- Right? That's like the administration and the mayor's leadership as well.
I agree.
And
I
the
mean,
structure of, like we were talking about the other night, the structure of of the bureaucracy and how that sometimes works against stated policy consensus between the mayor and the council, right?
So, bringing this back to appointments, where we are right now is still looking at, so if we start, let's just tackle these things, and if we say that, so let's go with the, just using the city attorney's chart, and we could use John's chart too, but we say that these ones are these are the legislative ones, the ones on the far left, correct?
The ones under CCEC are the more legislative ones, and the ones under finance are the more administrative ones. The ones of the common council are the ones that are required either by statute or serve some sort of quasi-judicial function that we really can't get rid of.
So,
They're sort of neither of the two.
without having to do chalkboard work, we'll just say that two other ways of doing this. So one way would be the way that this task force was structured, where you had half of it is, or there's a joint between the mayor's office and the common council that creates the task force. And then the other example would be the common council alone appoints the members. So if we start with the common council alone, what do we see in terms of, let's just use this list here. What do you see the pros and cons, or the, how would we see that looking in real life? And assuming that the foil is the way it is now.
The problem that I see with this is that you don't develop expertise on a committee that's the oversight committee. There are, a gazillion subject matters, if you look under the finance committee, are things that are going on. And maybe the finance committee is a good one to have oversight over those. I don't know, but if you're getting to housing and economic development, and you want to have multiple, say 5 committees under that to look at particular things, you develop an expertise, but that expertise gets funneled up, and I think the supervision of what the committees are doing then becomes centered in this mother committee, and they can direct who does what, and the input they get, and they become the policy making board for that particular subject matter that then comes to the council. And my idea of that was, why is that a good idea? I thought was because it could make decision-making at the council level more efficient, because it would have already been vetted by the time it got there by a good number of alders who concentrated on that policy.
Sir, welcome. We have suspended Robert's rules. Roger's rules also, we suspended those first, then we suspended Robert's rules. So you are welcome to join us at the table or join the conversation.
All right, thank you. All right, late.
Do a crossword, whatever you would like to do here. What kind of committee we are. I don't know, any thoughts on what?
So I know, I'm trying to layer,
Yeah.
because I think your argument is legitimate and has merit and really would make a difference in a number of ways. And I also like thinking about, I'm trying to layer that on top of this and the backside of that sheet, which I have kind of in my mind how that's done by function.
I don't have any of my copies, so just give you that, but it doesn't matter what it looked like, I mean, it's just a concept.
So, something that has been sticking with me all week was something that Grant Foster said at our meeting earlier this week about a single alder represents their district. All the alders together on the council do represent the city as a whole, just as the mayor represents the city as a whole, in different ways, right? And so, as far as the oversight power of the council, I think that's really important. I also think it's really important for a mayor to be able to implement her or his or their agenda through the bureaucracy of the city. But that collective oversight is also really important, especially around the budget. And a lot of that, the expertise that's developed around the budget is developed by individual alders on committees, right? Because that's how we understand functions of government, that's how we understand, policies and how they're working out or not working out. And which is why I find John's proposal really intriguing, because I think it helps to organize that that oversight function in a better, more effective way. And it kind of mitigates against single alders trying to do power plays, right? If there's more alders on these mother committees, you're not in a situation where the report back to the council is from the one alder that's on a committee and, they can do their own agendas. So, and this is just me processing verbally.
I guess I would ask whether, it's as simple as saying that all the alders together represent the entire city, because that's assuming there's like a Voltron thing that's going on. You guys all understand the reference? Voltron? It's all the lines that turn into one big robot. Anyway, there's this idea that it's gonna come together to form the whole. And I don't know that that's always true, right? So, and I also.
But that's where it's like statutory power is in that, like, that's the theory of a council, right? That's the theory.
And a
Anyway.
critique of it also is that they actually do not, none of them represent the whole
Right.
city, they represent the people who voted for them, which is, as we've seen, and at the end of the day, it's 6% in some cases of any aldermanic district, there's 6% of people that any alder is representing, because that's ultimately who votes, right? 6% of a district.
Well, you say that about the mayor too.
Right, no,
22%, whatever.
all I'm saying, just for.
But, right.
Anyway, I agree. So just real quick, because we still are on appointees, so in any of these cases, again, using the current structure as the foil, meaning the way that the mayor's office is who initiates it, they refer to the common council for appointments onto these things. If we were to change, now the other two things we've discussed are the idea that there would be joint, that there would be some capacity for a joint as this task force, and the other things for the common council. How would we see appointments being different, or how would we see that playing out in either or any of these alternative structures?
Well, under what I was saying before, if CEC did the appointing, and I don't know what the role is of the residents in that, but I would still see those having to go to the council for approval,
Yeah.
and same for the automatic appointments of
Yeah.
the mayor. I mean,
Yeah.
residence appointments by the mayor.
Yeah.
So it doesn't take the council out of that process, I don't think. I think it's just an important check that if, you know, you have a road CEC, or something, you know, or something goes wrong, somebody doesn't get vetted, there's some reason the council should still have a say in who's on the committees.
Right, and we also talked about not, a prior step that could be taken in the process, which is instead of the council and the public learning of appointments when an agenda comes out, council leadership gets invited to the appointment meetings with the mayor, when the mayor talks to staff about potential appointments, and is consulting at that prior stage before appointments ever come out. So that could be like, the power stays the same, but the process, within the process, there is more council involvement before any decision is made. So that was another kind of alternative we discussed.
So how would that work? There's a committee and therefore, how would it work?
So, no, the council, so the mayor every couple of weeks, I don't know, Nick, is it like every 2 weeks, once a month, something like that? When does he, you're probably never.
On which, on
On
appointments?
committee appointments.
So there is a regular meeting that
Yeah.
it has on appointments, but I would also, I mean, they also happen kind of on an ad
Randomly.
hoc basis as well. It's not that clean. So, and all I can speak for is this mayor, but I would say that's not, you know, the appointments I've been involved in, and I know working with the other deputies, it often comes up weekly. At a staff meeting, I have one person I want to fill, here's who it is. I think that meeting that you're referencing is a great place for Lila to sit and kind of get everyone in the room and go through a lot of the vacancies and hash it out. But it's certainly not that intermittent.
But also, the mayor and council leadership meet every week, so that could be a standing item on the agenda, on that leadership, that council leadership meeting with the mayor, like proposed appointments. You know, it could be fairly simple. So he has a meeting with you and you're like, oh, I have an idea for someone, and then he just brings it to, or she. So there are things that could improve the process, I think, without changing appointment powers, but we do need to, I think it would make sense for the council to make, the council executive committee to make some appointments, and I guess we need to talk about what those would be.
Can I just one question? I apologize because I came late.
You could ask 3 questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to be judicious about how I, is the idea that the council's constantly feeling blindsided by appointments and unhappy with it, or
Sometimes,
get the
yeah.
context of it?
And that the process is such that it's really awkward to object to one person in this whole slate of appointments in that 2-week period when a prior discussion could have really solved some conflicts.
Well, Paramount above that though, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the big issues that's been brought up is not just like anyone getting appointed, but specifically the alders that get appointed to those, to which committees, right? Wasn't that one of the big issues?
That's another one, that's a different, but that's not what, so this process would, because the alders get appointed once a year. Right, so there's one discrete process for that, usually happens right after the, you know, in April, by the end of April. But these rolling appointments for committee members.
So we did that last week too, right? We had to look at, or Monday or whenever we met, but the idea though, that we should make sure that we're making that distinction between
Alder residents.
alder and residents, because they seem to have different, there's different interest in looking at how those appointments are made, right? So the alders, I said, his esteemed colleague from District 15 has a specific, this case that he brings up often is the alders being appointed to the committees. And so how do alders, and why would the mayor decide which alders go to which committees? And then there's a whole conversation that exists in that arena And then the other thing is just appointments of residents and citizens to the committees, and then there's a conversation that exists in that agreement, right?
So if I could just, sorry, just to follow up, so is it feeling like, I mean, I get that they're coming out on the agenda, and so for some people it's the first time they've seen it. Is it your sense like the entire council has concerns with a particular appointee, but it's awkward to pull them off, or it's just an alder who might have a particular concern, but I don't want to kind of sit there and be the lone voice to say I don't like, you know, Bob or Sally? You know what I'm saying?
Sometimes
Like-
it's both, sometimes
Okay.
it's both.
So
Or just a couple, but by the nature of it, there's no way for the council leaders, I mean, it's up to individual alder initiative to then like go talk to the mayor or talk to council leadership and work it out in between the time it's been published and by the time they're confirmed. And then when, you know, if you do work out a deal, no, this person is an appointed when maybe the mayor's office has already talked to them and assured them they would. It's awkward, the process for how concerns can get raised. It's awkward, and I feel like it should happen before the initial publishing of potential candidates. That's all.
So building in more time, essentially. It went through council leadership, and I'm assuming what you're saying is council leadership would then pass it along to the full council?
Yeah, in the report, the council leadership report, which happens right after that meeting.
Because that's why I brought up the full council
Yeah.
versus individual alders, because really, when the mayor meets with council leadership, he's meeting generally with 2 alders. And so if neither of those two have a concern, if it doesn't get beyond that, it doesn't really achieve.
But if our
kind
chief of staff, sends us an email right after that meeting saying this is blah, 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 right?
So
It can
building
be
in
done
kind of more
pretty-
time and more advanced notice
Yeah.
before it's public, that these are the people in the.
Yeah, and not a lot of more time, maybe, a week.
Mhm.
Okay, I'm just pulling up this, I'm curious about how people feel about the intersection of the ways that, for the things that we did lift up with the challenges that we saw with the committees and BCCs in general, how the appointment process intersects with any. So one thing just start with because it's something that I have a concern with, but we can move on from it. But the idea of representation, the skew in representation that we've identified. So there are a very small number of districts that make up the overwhelming majority of people on these committees, BCCs. And when you throw in the fact that the districts that seem to be overrepresented on BCCs, their respective alder, one of them, District 4, seems to be on a lot of BCCs also.
16, I just wrote it down.
So what you have there is you have a very significant skew in terms of influence by one very small part of the city, right? The question here is how does the appointment process intersect with that one issue? And then we can kind of, and if we have other things, but I just do want to real quick just throw it up against the stuff that we did lift up as being the challenges.
Well, under these various alternatives we're considering, how does that change that?
Well,
I would
it's not about the alternative structures, it's about the appointment process. And so about how appointments, if we were to change the way that people were appointed onto these committees, I guess the question is there a way to mitigate this skew through tinkering or otherwise altering the appointment process?
Well, I think if you put more alders on other committees, you at least get across the council's makeup different aldermanic districts being represented on the mother policy making committee.
So to the alders in the room, 2 of 20, seems to me about right. How would you guys feel about quotas though? You're saying that you guys have to serve.
No, I really like it if we sort of reconceptualize which are the committees that we're quoted on, right? So Alder Revere is on 16 committees. Alder Hall was on 2. Alder Cheeks is on 4. I'm on 10. Rummel is only on 4. She's like one of these from these power districts of residents on committees. She's only on 4. Bedar's on 8. Wood is on 10. So a lot of the Verveer and Wood committee, Zellers is on 7. The Wood, Verveer, and Zellers committees are some of these that wouldn't rise to the level of mother committees. They're all of these little downtowny bid, you know, things that are specifically tied to the district that Brenda was talking about. And that if we're rethinking all of those, and if they had to be ad hoc-y or, you know, as per point 4 on this, you know, having a limited jurisdiction, a report date, and existing for 24 months, I mean, I think that's okay. But I kind of like the council having their own rule of everyone has to serve on 2 or 3 major committees. And then the rest could be, you know, optional.
Well, everybody jump in. I mean, I know, you know, Brandon, we'd love to hear your take on it too. How do you feel?
Oh, I agree. I mean, I think it's, I agree with the separation. There are some committees that, and that doesn't minimize how much time you spend. I mean,
Right.
I just jumped on an ad hoc committee that's probably going to be the most intensive committee that I'm on.
Yeah.
But as far as, you know, importance and impact, I think, you know, figuring out those tiers and then having a quota, I think that helps spread it around. And then I guess inversely, you'd have a limit too then, of how many an alder can be on?
Of these, of these,
Yeah.
like, you know, mother committees. And it would prevent the perception and maybe even the practice of the mayor appointing ringers to all of the powerful committees. Right?
Well, we can go down, sorry, just,
And, you know,
there's some
my,
other things on this. Another thing that I think we should look at in this is this question of the difference of authority. Now, we get that some of it is actually addressed in executive, legislative, or the financial nature of the committees themselves, but another thing that we talked about with this is that, just lack of another way to put this, is that there's this feeling, I mean, especially for things that are making funding decisions or approval decisions, is that we should not, I mean, the question comes up about the degree to which shouldn't our elected officials be making these decisions and not having other people making these decisions, especially because how people end up on the committees that are making funding and approvals and all these other, that's where it starts to get interesting about how people are ending up on those committees making those decisions. And that's where, I mean, something that we haven't talked about today, and I don't think we talked about this on the 5th, but the question is the degree to which there's the political bartering that goes on to get people on committee, you know what I mean? I'll do this if you do this, the quid pro quo, if you will, to get folks onto these committees. So again, thinking about how appointment changes that. So why do we have people who are unelected, who have no term limits, and there is no accountability, it seems like, to anybody, making decisions about how, especially when we look at the way that it's distributed across the city, we have a very exclusive, select group of people who are making decisions for the entire city on a lot of issues that are not elected and that have there's no accountability structure, right? So how does appointments intersect with that, or how does it address it? And again, it's what I just said is more, I mean, what we talked about was authority, and there's a difference of authority within each one of these committees, and that different ones have different powers or have different, some of them they not only are seen as advisory, but they feel very much advisory, as if anything they're going to do may or may not, anyone may listen, whereas other ones very much are either by statute or by default are in essence the final say. And the way we looked at that at the very beginning was the question of the degree to which any of these things ever, if a recommendation comes forward, how often is it the case that the council ever doesn't agree with whatever comes forward from that committee?
I think by making all of the non-statutory decisions run through these mother committees that are composed, maybe a majority, maybe not a majority, but a good number of alders on those committees, means that those alders will have a significant role in making the decisions and therefore become accountable for those decisions. Before it goes to the council, it has to go through the mother committee.
Okay.
So that's and it's like a line authority. I mean, you bring, all those committees report to that mother committee, and we gotta come up with that, give or take. But anyway, the big committee, that's okay. But anyway, the committee, the standing committees, whatever, you have to go through that, and if it goes, and they decide whether it's gonna go to the council with a favorable recommendation or not. And that's your accountability.
Because there are good reasons for residents to be on committees. I mean, there are really good reasons there's really good reasons why you guys
Sure.
are on this committee right now. You guys specifically, with your histories and your locations and the, political economy and social history of Madison, there's really good reasons for that. But there should be some accountability somewhere, right?
Well, but ultimately, this is, this is an advisory body. That's all we're doing.
But
Right.
So,
the other
at the
side
end
of what
the day-
Rebecca is saying is that it's a good thing that there are alders here too, right?
Mhm.
People who are
Yeah.
serving now, people
No,
who have
absolutely.
served. I mean, I mean, it's a good concept, I think. And while we're advisory, and they'll have to do it, it still is gonna get vetted and taken.
Yeah, I think that the problem you're talking about the, the funding committees, especially in the, CDD, is not the structure of it, but the practice of the council as a whole just rubber stamping decisions, which de facto makes that group of unelected people, mostly unelected people, the decision makers.
Well, and
Right.
there's an interesting thing, well, and this is why, I think it's interesting you say this, because currently what it could suggest is that the mayor's office has significant authority or authority over this, because ultimately in some of these, as we've heard or discussed, it seems like the staff seem to really be the ones who are making the decisions for the committees,
Yeah.
which ultimately fall under the mayor's office, which is what we're going to discuss, what we're going to figure out a way to address or discuss. So what you're saying then,
Begs the question, why even have committees if the mayor's just deciding?
that's right. And
Why
so,
don't we just make the record conform to the fact and let the mayor decide?
and this is months ago that we talked about this, but the question is, and it's like the easy critique, the low-hanging fruit is to say, well, I don't feel like Alders really read anything because they were asking questions that are sitting in front of them in the material that they're supposed to be covering, and it's like on the front page, and they're sitting here like, well, have you thought about, have you thought about whether it should be red or green? And on the front, it's like, this will be red because of this. And it's like, did you read the thing that was given to you? So we talked about it in essence. Now, but of course, the argument is that, well, if I'm on 8, 10 committees, I work full-time, and all these other things, it's very difficult. And I also have to be, in terms of the things that are coming before the council from other committees that I'm not on, how do I actually do a deep dive on any of these things? So I have to kind of come in there, and I rely heavily on who's staffing them and who actually the staff is that I'm working with, which we'll talk about before we leave today. But so all of a sudden you get this situation where you're, in essence, you're just listening to whatever staff are saying.
And it's political theater.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I would say that that's skewed where that's happening, or where again, we got to talk to staff to actually say that this is happening in one place or another. But I would wonder whether it's happening more in some of these, the ones that either have approval by statute or approval by, de facto approval. And so this is, this again would be a concern, because where you have a large number of committees and a bunch of people on them, it gives you and John, I had your thing up. Well, I just have a million things from John Stratton. But the question of the veneer of representation versus actual representation. So the idea is, by having this giant council and this giant committee structure, we're going to maximize representation, when in practice it's doing the opposite, is that we have very little representation across the city of a lot of people, right? So again, if we change the appointment structure, does that change, does it address any of what I just said? The one thing I just said.
It could, potentially.
I mean, I think we've heard that it's difficult to recruit people to serve on committees. And it's the same thing, it's the people who serve on the council. They're, for whatever reason, they can arrange their schedule so they can get done what the job demands, or, you know, more than the job demands.
Well, and I'll channel Eric Upchurch, who I
Yeah.
felt like the thing was, is it really hard to recruit people to do that, or is it really hard to recruit people to do a lot of work for free, whether or not the work that they're
With
gonna do
no
is gonna be
impact.
valued?
Yeah.
Right,
You know what I mean? Is that the challenge?
Yeah.
yeah,
And, you know, it's so like, what is the challenge? Is it really hard?
yeah.
And again, it doesn't seem to be difficult to recruit consultants. They seem to be really good at that, right? So we
So,
can,
right, so this
Yeah.
goes back to the idea of creating, you know, a different structure that is able to actually organize and be in the neighborhoods and get, you know, not necessarily through the formal BCC structure, but prior to ideas coming through, to organize ideas and really the lived reality of people in the city and the issues they're dealing with. And then to bring that forward through a policy-making structure that people have confidence in will actually make a difference. I mean, I think that's the crux of this nut we're trying to crack, right?
right, okay, so moving through this, in terms of staffing, so I don't know, I mean, right now, and again, this will help us when we get to talk to actual staff about how they interact with these BCCs. But right now, if we look at the way that people are appointed to this committee, does it impact or does it affect or inform the way that the committees are staffed in any way? And it can just be no, and that's fine, we can just move on. But I don't know that it does, I'm just curious, I'm just using this little tool.
I don't think it does.
Would you think that, depending on the alder and the intensity, personality, et cetera, of an individual alder, well, I guess what I'm asking is if you had the council appointing their own to these committees, and more of what we want to find out is the degree to which the council sees their role in these committees as managers versus legislators. Would that increase the likelihood that you're going to have alders who are trying to actually manage staff versus serving as legislators on these committees? And so if you had an alternative structure where you had the council appointing their own to these committees, would that, how would that affect that, or would it?
To some extent, I think there's safety in numbers. If you have 4 or 5 on the
Yeah.
committee, then you don't have one alder that's sitting there, whereas if in the committee structure as it is now, you might have one alder who's on the committee, maybe 2, one doesn't show up. So it's really just one alder that takes an interest in that particular committee's jurisdiction. I also think that if you have the policy-making, the true policy-making filter of the mother committees there, it gives you an opportunity for community engagement that you don't have when you have so many committees. I mean, we heard how there's no way of doing it now for any committees. If we try and do resident engagement so that they can participate from distance, give testimony and so forth, they could focus on those mother committees, at least to start with spreading that out. So that also, I think, provides a check against inappropriate, I mean, you're always going to have the issue about motivating people to participate in that kind of event, but it would allow them to if they chose to, at least. That if they wanted to go to a library somewhere and 5 of them wanted to sit in that library and watch and participate in that meeting, in a two-way kind of conversation, they could.
Back to your question, I mean, it just came to me that we could sort of flip the process. If we did CCEC coming up with an own internal process for alder appointments to committees, you could have the mayor be able to say, to veto some. Right, instead of right now, which is the mayor just picking alders individually, the mayor not engaging with the council as a whole at all for alder appointments, just individually doing the selection. If we had CCEC do a process of sorting each council member's preferences and coming up with a slate of alders appointments to committees, and then the mayor going through them and just saying, I can't live with that, I can't live with that, and have that be a point of negotiation, I think that would be a lot more functional than the way it is now.
Okay.
Would you argue, though, that he'd have that ability if the council approved it to veto? I guess he'd have to veto the whole list of appointments then.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it would work if the CCEC managed a process, an internal process where everyone's preferences, which we do, that we give our preferences to the mayor anyway. The CCEC organizes that. Again, not just the president. I think this fails if it's just, one personality doing it. I think it really does have to be a bunch of people looking at it for fairness. And so you at least minimize the amount of bias that could go into it. Come up with a slate and propose that, and give the mayor sort of a right of refusal for, have the mayor look at that, and she
On an
hear they can-
individual alder basis or on the slate basis?
Can look and see how it's sorting out and say, I really can't live with, I can live with, 95% of it, but I can't live with that person on that committee. I can't live with that person on that committee. Can you go back and, rearrange it without them necessarily handpicking, I want this, this, and this on that, right? But at least give the mayor a chance to say,
Why?
this is gonna really mess up my.
Why would you let the mayor decide the legislative body's appointments?
He doesn't, they do anyway now.
Well, but in all the other legislatures, it's not like that, right? Like, you don't think of other legislative bodies, that's not the way that it works. Why would the mayor be able to veto somebody being on a committee if there's consensus on CCEC?
It was just a thought. It's
Well, I know it's like a-
transitional step from the extreme way it is now, which is the council has zero authority as a body. And I do think it's real, it is a real thing that there can be council leadership and mayors that just clash and intentionally try to undermine the work of the other. And I don't think we as a city want to be in that situation at all. I mean, that's what really has given rise to our work here right now.
So
Is to really try to come up with some more cooperative ways of doing things. So to answer your question, that's why.
I can see the idea of fostering collaboration, but what if it doesn't work? So the mayor objects to 5 people, the CCEC says, that's too bad, that's the best slate we can give you, here it is. Then what happens? Goes to the council?
Maybe,
As the CCEC
maybe, but I
has
think
approved
just
it?
at least professional courtesy. We're all trying to govern the city together. You give that person the opportunity. Possibly the council does, ultimately make the decision, but.
Real quick, it is 1,500 hours and 5 minutes, 3:05 in the PM. Does anyone have to leave early today? Because I do want to make sure we discuss the staff question, but if not, we can just keep going. But because a couple things, some of these I think it's pretty, do you sit in, sir, on the way the appointments, the standing meetings right now?
Some of them, yeah.
So, as I understand it, the question right now is about the diversity, not in terms of representation, but in terms of diversity in race, gender, identity, and class. As I understand it, the mayor is deliberate about attempting or creating pathways for diversity on the committees as it stands. We still don't have it on the committee, so the question is if we change the way that committees are appointed, do we feel like that would somehow address this issue that we've discussed here? So if there was another form, whether it's the council appointing people or whether it's that joint structure, or I said, arbitrary, you get a letter in the mail, you're on the committee, or else you go to jail.
Jury duty.
Jury duty.
No, I think if we establish this new agency and a lot of their work is being in the community and recruiting and, gaining the confidence of residents by actually engaging them in ways where they have an impact on some things in their neighborhoods. I mean, I think that's a long-term strategy that requires trust building. You know, to your point, Justice, of saying, why would people want to do free labor in a process that they don't believe in? I think we have to start there, and that appointment power is of would have a lesser impact on creating that than this sort of community, resident engagement process would.
What if we looked at doing it the way this committee was formed, where there were two, let's say it's a 4 alder committee. Two of the alders could be appointed by the CCEC, and 2 could be appointed by the mayor. And then you're going to get a distribution of political leanings, perhaps, but certainly more opportunity for diversity in terms of those picks. I don't know. And I don't know.
Sir?
I was just gonna say, and it seemed like there were a couple different points there on different issues. I mean, I just would say that there's a tremendous amount of effort that's put into kind of recruiting and diversity, and so I want to make sure that that's clear. Like, it's not like people are just throwing in applications and we just go 1, 2, 3, great. I mean, there's huge amounts put into that, and so it seems like in the last couple comments I was hearing a difference between kind of diversity of, or I should say, splitting up political power and saying I want to diffuse that between the 2 branches, as opposed to I'm looking at the current kind of historical makeup of committees, and gee, it's not kind of getting as diverse, you know, racially, socioeconomically, in terms of older districts as we'd like. I don't know if there are structural changes that'll address that.
And I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like we've agreed that one of the major moderators in terms of who's going to actually be involved in democratic processes is class. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, whether people are, you know, like where you are in terms of income distribution is going to greatly influence whether or not you're going to be involved in political processes in general. We've established that, but we still, even aside from that, we're still having a hard time. And, you know, I agree with you in terms of that it's currently an effort, and I guess the question is the degree to which changing the appointment, the way that the appointment process is right now, we're just talking about appointment, and the way that appointments work right now, the way that is actually having an effect on representation or not, right? So, I mean, so I don't know that, again, so I don't know that changing that, the appointment process or the way is gonna do much
measurable
for
impact, because the efforts are, I mean, and already alders are trying to, you know, are helping.
Well, should note, I mean, what did we lose?
Yeah.
3
Staff does that too.
And
I mean,
staff, yeah.
Staff that supports committees more
Yeah.
often, you know, who do we know? You know, when we know someone's going
Yeah.
to go off, that we do a lot of work, they know.
So I think it's this trust
bunch
building,
of-
it's this trust building piece that we really need to work on.
I guess, and I would be curious if, we've heard a rumor of people being blacklisted, and so people can't get on the committees either,
Yeah.
so.
Well, I was gonna say that, a little bit of transparency in this process would go a long ways, I think. So if it was understood, like, there's this opening, and it's been open for a really long time, people have applied for it, and nobody is getting appointed to it, why is that happening? And if it is because this committee currently has 9 men, and we need more women, well then, if there was some sort of transparency about we're looking for women for this committee, then people would apply appropriately. And I think that's going on in the background. I think the staff are doing it. I think the mayor's office is doing it. I think people are doing it, but I don't think it's clear to the people who might be trying to apply to the committees about why, you know, why is this happening?
And I looked at
I mean-
Alder Kimball because it sounds like if not the specific function of this office, but if not the office, but the function of it, one of it would be marketing or communication
Yeah,
about the demand,
More broadly.
where we are.
Yeah.
Something I will just note is that we lost 3 people for this committee, correct? From the beginning, we lost 2 women and a person of color, and they were replaced by 3 white men. 2 of them that are, I was about to say, well, 2 of them that are, well, whatever. Point is, that's who replaced. That's who replaced.
Ex-alders, ex-city, high-level city manager. Yeah.
Right, that's who replaced, so you got that thing that happened here even, right? So like, right now, it's like, anyway, it's just something that,
And I've attended more meetings than all of them.
And I think just on top of that, I know that was something we talked about very explicitly, that exact fact in terms of those replacements. We're very conscious of that kind of problem. But also in recruiting to this committee, I also say like, there was a lot of nudging and pushing around getting people when this initially went out to put in applications, and those supplemental nudgings and pushings and press releases really didn't yield a ton of additional names.
and there's all this stuff you can read into this, because people don't realize how fun this is. No, but well,
It's awesome.
but then I think there's another point that I'll just see the point, which is, in some ways, I do think that for whatever, you can say how we agree or disagree with different points that are made by the people who have been, who have replaced the original members, I will say that they have actually brought legitimate contribution. So in some ways, it brings in that challenge, right? So like the idea is that even though it has made the committee less representative than maybe it was when we started, the contributions by those people who have come in, I think, have been very helpful to the task force as a whole. So like you get this thing. I don't know, is there anything else we want to talk about in terms of diversity and accountability? Because I think right now, the training for chairs and members, does that, if the appointment.
That's huge for trust building, I think, and for making people feel like they know what they're doing, the expectations are clear and their contributions are effective. Right, I think that's a huge part.
But how does that change? That's what I'm saying. No, I get it. That was one of the things that we brought up as being a
That
challenge.
we have to do that, right?
Right, so the question is, to the degree to which the current appointment process informs or influences or affects that area. So I don't know that appointment has anything to do with if the council were to appoint people, or if we were to come up with a joint appointment process. I don't know that
Well,
would change.
it's just the fact that that position that is supposed to be supporting and doing the training is in the mayor's office, is 100% in the mayor's office right now.
I thought the city attorney did it.
No, Lila's supposed to do it.
We do,
Delilah.
we offer trainings on Robert's rules, public records, open meetings, that sort of thing.
Oh, okay.
But not a larger training on, you're gonna be on the such and such commission, here's what it does, and here's how you operate, here are the rules for
Right.
commissions. That's what-
So it's still not so much about appointments, so much as the process.
We had, this was.
The lack of
a couple
support
years ago.
resources for board BCCs, let's put it that way.
Right.
Let's put it that way.
And then the role of BCCs, if the appointment process were different, if we had a different process of appointing people, whether residents or alders, to BCCs, do we think that would have any impact on the definition or the clarity as to whether their deliverables or the actual purpose of the BCCs would be? Because one of the things we identified was it's not always clear
Yeah.
as to what they're supposed to be doing, how they're supposed to be doing it, and when they're supposed to be doing it.
I think not really.
Okay, so appointments would not address that.
I don't know. I don't think it would really have.
It might on the other committees. Considering that you'd have alders, more alders.
And then, so
It would
we
be
pretty
slight
close
if
to, I
it-
mean,
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, I agree, I don't know
Yeah.
that I see anything. The other question is large number of vacancies. So we identify, would we say a couple hundred right now that we have? So we have a number of vacancies, and that's pretty much, that's just Tuesday, right? Like, we always have a couple hundred vacancies. Do we think that the appointment process right now, as it stands, is one of the impediments to filling these things?
Possibly.
I would wonder whether or not the consideration that potentially there are folks who will never get on, or let's just say that there are people who, how do we say this in a way that doesn't insinuate malicious insidious intent? The idea is that some people would be seen as political liabilities as serving on committees, and so therefore, or if you have one person or one entity that's responsible for appointing them, there's more of a likelihood that that one individual could be, I would be curious as whether or not there would be more of a likelihood that that individual would
Blacklisting, yeah.
be a gatekeeper. So in some ways, if you had a more, whether it was a joint process or if you had a larger body that was able to draw upon folks, you'd have less likely that could potentially be the case.
True.
Okay. And then relevance and redundancy, do we think that the appointment process right now is doing anything to relevance and redundancy?
That's more back-end structure of the whole thing.
Can I quick say something?
Yeah. Brenda, please.
I did an open records request in July, and I asked how many people have applied to be on committees that weren't appointed, and there was 445 people who were sort of in the pool of people to be on committees, according to Enos. And then he gave me a breakdown of how many people were sitting there waiting that had applied for each committee. Some of the 445 have been appointed to another committee. So maybe, you apply and you say, I want to be on housing, planning, and, the transportation board or something like that. And maybe you get appointed to one of them, but your name was still there as being wanting to be on one of those other committees. So I don't really know where that overlap is. But to say that there's not people who have applied to be on these committees, I think is not correct. And I can forward this to you guys. I never did anything with it, but 445 people sitting there waiting to be appointed to committees and hundreds of vacancies don't seem to add up to me.
Can you, would it be all right, can she forward that to you?
Sure.
If you could forward it to,
Well, I'm sure they could recreate this and give you current information.
well, I think it's interesting,
but-
because the question then, again, going back to what the topic is the degree to which if we had, so if we had a different screening process, and let's just say it's a matter of a number of hours in a week, if you only have one person ultimately able to look at this, you're gonna have a limited amount of bandwidth to look at. Whereas if you had a larger group of folks looking at all these things, it could hold that you have more bandwidth collectively to look at potential applicants, and therefore it may help in terms of the efficiency with which the committees are formed, or BCCs are formed or filled.
It was also said, I don't know who said it, but somebody from the mayor's office said that they deliberately do not fill because they're looking to find diversity on it. So we don't know, this group of 445 people might be all people who look like me, in which case they were not going to make an appointment to that committee. So,
But when there's committees that can't get quorum
Yeah.
and they can't meet, are you just gonna let those vacancies sit there?
Well,
And is that intentional?
I would say this also, there's a question of the degree to which the number of committees is at play here, but I also go back to Alder Kemball's commentary about if you have more so you don't want to create a process that you can create deliberate fissures, so like you got to get these committees filled, but like, so, we're just going to put folks on there whether or not they're going to be productive in the process of, and doing the work or the idea or the circumstance where you might have putting someone on a committee just so they can run interference on that committee and make sure that it doesn't do anything.
Right.
So like, there's also that. So if you had more people involved in that, there's more of a likelihood that you're gonna get, or there could be more of a likelihood that you are gonna end up with a situation where people are throwing people on committees to make sure that the work doesn't get done.
Yeah.
So that would also, the question then would, if you have that joint thing where, and again, you could do this in terms of balance, right? So you could look at it and so, all right, you're not gonna get a majority of the committee filled by this other group, but you can, if the committee's 9, you can have 4. You guys get to fill 4 of those roles, and then the other 5 are up to the mayor's office. So in that case, if you were to increase the number of folks that are looking at potential committee members as a way to mitigate the vacancy challenge that was identified, however that's looked at, it would probably also hold that you would want to make sure that you're doing something to make sure, it's a lot of make sure's, that you're doing something to avoid that type of
Intentional
situation.
dysfunction.
Right.
So, just to be clear, there's 445 individuals who have applied for 932 positions. And there were 21 people who wanted to be on this committee last July. So there's 21 people sitting there. That was their pool that they had to choose from.
You're talking.
And there were women in that pool.
Citizens? Or
Residents, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, those are the numbers that I got from the mayor's office again in July, and I think they can recreate this report. I don't think it's hard. And maybe they could even give you more detail about gender and race.
Did you say 900 positions?
932. So 445 people applied to be in 932 positions, because you apply and you ask to be on more than one committee. So you ask for three, yeah.
That's not, okay, I was gonna say that's 235 more than I thought we had.
No. It's, so then he has it broken down by committees, like
Well, there's 15 more committees than last week.
24 people are sitting there waiting to, like, have applied to be on the Affirmative Action Commission. So they break it down that way then. Which is why I can see that 21 people applied to be on this committee that were not appointed.
Any other comments in terms of the vacancy question as it pertains to appointments?
Just that, again, I think the Orens will go a long way if we have a more robust administrative support structure, more eyes on it, more people concerned in a tangible way in their day-to-day, what they do as a job. It'll help.
Okay, so even with that, right, just as a matter of discussion, so let's hypothetically say we have this orange thing in place. How does appointments, okay, so at that point, if we had this in place, would appointments matter as much? Or how would this question of the way that people are currently appointed on to boards, commissions, and committees matter as much if we had that, or how does it intersect with appointment?
It would matter, it would intersect, but all I'm saying is that there would maybe be fewer excuses for the vacancies if there's people really generating more recommendations, and again, generating not just from the mayor or alder networks, personal networks, or even individual staff personal networks, but if this office has a charge of being in the neighborhoods and involved in the neighborhoods, and having that involvement be specifically linked towards filling committee roles. I mean, I think you bring so much more capacity to building the pool of potential.
So help me
BCC
think about this, because again, try not to, or not, recommending this orange thing
Right.
out of this subcommittee. However, we could say that a number of the issues that we've discussed that pertain to the challenges or the contestation around appointments to boards, commissions, and committees are administrative or structural in nature, and many of which could potentially be addressed or mitigated by the creation
Yes.
of something along those lines.
Yeah, good way of putting it.
The last thing here is the BCC relevance and redundancy. So the thing that we talked about is that many of the boards, commissions, and committees, there was questions as to the degree to which they are still relevant or needed, or whether or not their permanence is relevant, or you need a permanent group of people to meet on something that is, it's antiquated in terms of its function, and then also that there are many of these that are redundant in terms of their form, function, and total existence. You have a redundant existence. No, so do we think that the way by which folks are, whether city council, alders, or residents are appointed to these informs or otherwise affects the relevance and redundancy of boards, commissions, and committees?
I think the inverse is true, though. The relevance and redundancy affects our ability to appoint.
Well, the only way that I see this in turn is if you did this where the city council was responsible for filling these things, and then they had to fill them with themselves, I could see them being very, all of a sudden, they would be very concerned with the number and the redundancy of these things, because they would have to fill them. So they would be like, I feel like I'm having the same conversation in 6 different meetings. Maybe we just need to have one big meeting. And so I think maybe it could be the case that having the city council more involved in the appointment process, it could potentially influence
Put
their,
pressure on,
well, let's just say that if they have no incentive right now to get rid of or to make the BCC structure smaller, more lean, if they all of a sudden were responsible for filling them with themselves, I think maybe they would, maybe it could be said that they would have more incentive to think about whether or not we need all these things, right? All right. Those are the things, those are kind of our little diagnostics tool that we have. If there are other things that we should be discussing, that we want to make sure that we should be discussing in terms of appointments and the appointment process. I don't, without Alder Aarons being here to do his thing about
yeah, I
everything, it's
texted
hard.
him and he said he'll email us his study that he's busy with his wife.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So just, I want to make sure John Strange got down, when we were talking about alternatives to the way it's done now, I heard potentially 3 different alternatives. Either common council makes all appointments, the appointments can be appointments, either alder or alder and residents can be made the way this committee was formed by splitting, and the alder appointments be made by CCEC with a sort of right of refusal to the mayor. Did we talk about any other potential way of doing it?
I think one thing we didn't talk about is removal from, and how that process could be different. And I'll just acknowledge to the group, when I look back at the way that we structured this subcommittee, it was an oversight to not include the appointment thing, because that was a significant thing. So we did this in a way that it was somewhat expedited in the way that we approached this part of it, which I think was crucial. That's my fault, and I apologize to the group, because I feel like we could have done better in terms of how we approach this. We kind of just slammed this thing together, Barney style, to just make sure that we got through it. I think it was a good discussion. I think we got some good points raised, but I don't know that we exhausted everything, because I think the question of removal, and again, if you put this in the check and balance thing again, right, where if you have a way to appoint and remove, and if you can tinker with the different formats through which you could do either or both, I think that could also alleviate some of the pressures that whether it's Alder Aarons or anyone else has addressed that are caused because of the current form or the current process through which people are appointed. So again, I owe you guys all one of those Italian beef sandwiches from Alimentari Deli. Make sure you collect, except for the alders, I can't get you guys anything. I'll get you the finest glass of water.
So there's one other issue that I don't think we've discussed, that I think was on our list to talk about at some point on BCCs, which is whether alders being allowed to chair committees or not allowed to chair committees. And I see that going both ways. And I think when you get to the mother committee structure, that's going to be sort of an important decision to make. If you keep a mix of residents and alders on those committees, who's going to run them?
For number 7, so I totally agree with you. How do we?
I don't know if we have to resolve that now or anything.
Well, we
but I
didn't
just
just note that we did not. Again, I'll
Yeah.
own that one too. So I'll
Is
give
it
you
too
guys-
soon post-Brewer to talk about it?
Well,
Because that's kind of why it is the way it is, because of the accumulation of power of one alder.
but if you're just
Oh,
putting proxy, I
historically.
mean,
It also goes back to this whole interaction we're going to talk about maybe in a few minutes with staff and committees. I think that, you have an alder that's on there, you run into the same problems that we've sort of danced around talking
Yeah,
about.
and that was the problem.
That was the
That was the Brewer problem.
Well, and so many of these things are semiotic in nature. And so whether or not, like having the alder as the chair versus having the majority of the committee from that alder's district and the alder's, you know, I don't know, I just,
No,
I
it's
think-
real. It's
yeah.
not just it's not just signifying, it's real.
And I think,
And there's 4 staff here. One doesn't have a whole lot of experience, but staff interaction with alders is really different from staff interaction with residents, even if that resident is, you know, like, when you all deal with the chair of the plan commission, you're not thinking of me. I'm his alder, right? You're not thinking of the power of Alder Kemble behind that. I mean, it is different.
I think when you have,
Yeah.
if you have a mixed committee, and you have a chair who's an alder, you're gonna have a different dynamic
Yeah.
on that committee, in terms of the participation of the residents. So,
And I think also, in terms of just leadership development for the city as a whole, it's really good for residents to have experience in that role. You know, if they might want to run for alder someday.
Right.
And it's good. I don't really feel a need to revisit that whole issue.
yeah, I mean, it's not on the agenda really. I'm
Yeah.
trying to figure out a way to put it on and how we can get artistic. Think about how this has to do with the appointments.
I mean, I think as we get
Well-
towards recommending an organization of the committees in the next
Yeah.
phase of this, that
Okay.
we'll have to revisit it. I mean, it should be at least touched on, I think.
So let's just drop it into agenda item number 7, and then real quick go through
Back to
6,
six.
and then we'll say that we need to, in the final report on this subcommittee, we should make sure that that is covered. How do we feel about that?
Right.
All right. Thank you all for, again, my apologies for the shortcomings of that. Discussion item. Next thing here is discussion regarding staff engagement. So for the unindoctrinated or those who did not join us at our last meeting, something that we talked about in this subcommittee and was brought up briefly and at the future agenda items, and I'm hoping the executive committee will take this up, is this committee in particular, but in general, this task force has not engaged with staff. And so there's, I think a number of us have either been approached or have talked to staff, and I think there's a general feeling there's a lot of important contributions that could be given to this task force. I think as the chair of this subcommittee, there are very real things that could be, that we could gain from discussing the relationship between staff and the committees, specifically the committees that intersect with their sections or whatever. The question that we want to address here, is how do we do that? Something that I was, so as I don't know if it's quoted or whatever, but I had a group of folks who approached me, 7 folks, who approached me as a group, but just as separate people from the city about this task force, with some significant concerns about their experience as staff members, about the way that committee members, in particular alders, elected officials on those committees, have interacted with them or their roles, power, et cetera, as part of these committees. And I think that's a really interesting, there were some really interesting things that were brought up that I think intersect with this. I'd like it to not just be some stuff I said one day at a meeting, and so therefore you all need to believe me, and instead get that as part of the actual record of the committee. And I'd be curious to hear folks' ideas. My big concern, and something that they emphasized and stressed, is that the confidentiality is a big deal. Now Madison, I would say, is like Sesame Street. Everybody's everywhere all the time. I see Carl everywhere. When I worked here, I thought Carl he was just being Carl at a different place. So he's always doing Carl things. So everyone's everywhere. So confidentiality is something that we'd have to really, I think, is paramount. And so if we were to do it, my suggestion initially was that it would not involve the alders in terms of talking to these groups and somehow, now I don't know how to do this though. This is what I'm saying, is get ideas from this group as to how we could do this in a way that would actually make sense. me cherry picking people from city staff that I know are interested in this is not effective either. Because at that point, it's not something that we could actually say represents the action, because, folks that justice knows, therefore, that's what's happening. I don't think that's effective either. So I don't know what people's ideas.
I feel like if you could describe the dynamics of the stories you're hearing, without the specifics, because I feel like I know some of the stories you're hearing. And they are pretty like content specific, but there are some dynamics, and they fall under the category of bullying. Would you agree?
I would. But bullying, intimidating,
Right.
threatening.
Threatening, bullying, intimidating, threatening. So, and if we can distinguish, are those like endemic to the structure of how committees work? Is that 1 or 3 people practicing these behaviors?
There was other stuff too, though. The things about the fact, in very explicit terms about the fact that alders and such don't really like where power is in the staff in terms of how things are presented and how to actually get things moved through these committees. Now, the challenge I have even now is so I'm going to tell you about this, a committee, let's hypothetically say it's in the northish side. There's no way to do this in a way that protects the autonomy of the individuals.
Yeah.
Someone was talking about this thing that had to do with Warner Park, and the alder that happened to maybe I'm just using, how do you do this in a way that...
Can you
Yeah.
tell me how it relates to the BCC structure?
I'll tell you, the reason...
This is what I'm trying to get at. Are these structural issues, or are these just
Yes.
bad behaviors?
Well, so yes, and there's two reasons, and it goes back to, two that I can think. So it goes back to appointments, and how alders are assigned to these things, and if the idea that we would that we would suggest that maybe a way to do this is to have the alders appointing themselves to these things versus the mayor doing this, because ultimately the city staff work for the mayor. And so when you have this other structure where, again, it goes, in some ways it's related to what Alder Kimball said about having committees created to deliberately impede or undermine.
A certain line of
Right.
progress on things, yeah.
Another way is because of the story of, I guess I thought of a third, but the second way was the idea of representation. So we have committees that are made up of primarily, so the distribution of residents across the city is not equitable right now, and so we have committees that overwhelmingly represent a very small number of districts. So people on committees who are making decisions, and then one way or the other, how they can be swayed or how they're trying to sway and influence staff's decision about...
You're talking about alders swaying, trying to sway
Yeah.
the decisions on the committee.
Exactly. And,
So with your residents.
well, not just the committee, but they should be doing that, right? That's their purpose of being on the committee, but the interaction with staff. My point, though, in more than anything, is in terms of that was something I just thought of. The third reason, but my initial second reason, is that I think our staff at the city would have a lot to say about the efficacy, the effectiveness, the redundancy, and a lot of the list that we just went through. I think they would have a lot to say based on their own experience working with these committees. And one of the big issues that we talked about was the amount of time that the city staff have to use, and all these guys are getting paid extra time at nighttime to be on all these committees, so the amount of cost it is in terms of staff time to be on all these committees. The IT department, I think, case in point, that's good information that we got from IT, because if everybody wants a website, we have 102 to the committees, and all of them want IT support. That's very expensive. And that's like a heavy lift. And so I think hearing from staff about the challenges that they have working with committees because of the what it takes. And I think it gets back to this inequity in terms of the importance of these things. One of the big questions that we did have, that we partially addressed, or we talked about in terms of Warren's, is that it is not always clear or equitable in terms of how these committees are staffed. And so sometimes if you have senior management on a committee that gives that committee a little bit more teeth in terms of ability to actually do something. Whereas sometimes if you have a committee that gets no staff, or like maybe you get a no, you know what I mean? Like that's totally different. So the inequities in the way that staff are expected to support these BCCs, I think it would be good for us to hear from staff about their experiences working with them versus us just postulating or making opinion, you know, based on what we think or what we're seeing. So those are my reasons, those now 3 reasons, but
I just want to get at, in a way, without asking for specifics in terms of the matter or the committee or the alder or anything. What you're really talking about is alders putting pressure on staff that are assigned to a committee. to come
there
up
was 2
with-
examples of that. There was a
To
number
make
of, there was
specific
a,
decisions.
there's just some folks that were interested in the work that we're doing. And there were a couple things that were kind of fall out of your seat things that you heard about, but then there was a lot of things that I think are just more routine. And so the question is like, when you're a staff person, who do you work for at that point? And
Yeah.
like, if you're, you know, like, and there's intersections here, even going back to the questions that we just had the other night at the actual full task force meeting about the mayor's office and, you know, like all these things. I think it would be important to hear from actual city staff
So-
about their experience
But
working.
on those experiences, is there any reason why they aren't willing, shouldn't be able to come talk to us about that?
Yeah, they said that,
Maybe
okay, so
Fear
yes.
of reprisals and I mean, if someone's intimidating
Okay.
and threatening and,
Yeah, so.
yeah.
And who can, I don't know how.
So
it
that,
works. I
if
mean,
that's the case, then how do we get to it? And I think Brenda had suggested a survey, at least, is one way to do it, to protect anonymity. But can they even give us enough details that we can understand it, that we won't know that, or at least someone reading or present at this would know who it is that's talking about these things?
in some ways, you know, it's funny because I know I've drawn on my own, it's problematic and I get it, or the limitations are there, but the work I did here for 3 years, and I wish I could reproduce that whole 3 years for this task force, because the information I got through interviews of all the staff, and I went high and wide with this thing, and I had a group that was group out in Boston who was randomly picking people for me to talk to, and it was enlightening. And the stuff that you learn about, and I think a lot of what Roger Goodwin brought up was, it surfaced about the way that roles and purpose and staffing structures start to meander, and that there is no real oversight of a lot of things, and no one quite knows exactly what someone's doing or why. And so I don't know, I think that survey methodology in terms of this, I mean, yeah, surveys would be better than nothing. So I think if we wanted to use surveys, that would be an option. And I think it may be, in terms of the time and the resources that we have available, maybe that's the best way to do it. Preferably, I'd like to put a call out and allow us to interview them with a few of us that are not elected officials or city staff, so that we can kind of lift up what we're hearing without getting into like specific issues. I'm not concerned with those specific issues. I just thought it in terms of the fact that some of the things that were brought up that I thought were kind of alarming came out of committee work.
Right.
So-
And things that were where you had alders or you had people on committees who had significant influence, and they somehow were allowed to sit on committees and make decisions about things that they were like, how are they on the committee if they are involved in that project? How is that happening? And how is no one seeing that there's like apparent, obvious conflicts of interest about things that are not just like opinions, but funding, you know, like things that are, you know, where a conflict of interest, people could personally gain or politically gain. I mean, how is that?
So these kinds of things are things that we couldn't do in a group, right? I mean, we can't do that because we're part of this group, so we couldn't do it, right? Because it's an open meeting issue.
No, we could. If, so we could do it if 2 of us were tasked to do it by the full task force.
No, I think we become separate.
No, then you're a separate thing.
So I know that Mike,
We just came up with it. I thought we came up with it on Tuesday or Monday, a way to do this, or the
No.
5th.
I don't think so.
No,
But anyway,
Mike
I know Mike
rejected.
said that, well, the city attorney's office could interview people and give us a report. I think from what you're describing, the city attorney's office would not be the appropriate
No.
agency to do that.
Absolutely not.
So I think we need Robert Mueller.
Well, that's
We
not
need-
again, the purpose
No,
of
no,
this.
but I mean, we need, and I was kidding about Robert Mueller. But what we need is somebody outside this committee who can interview people and give a report in a generic way that doesn't justify everyone. If that truly is the problem, that we can't get people to come and talk to us in an open meeting, then we need to have somebody who is independent, outside of this committee, not there. They'd be like staff to the committee, and they do this and they summarize it in a generic way. I mean, I think that's the only way we can do this, if we
They're
can't get
union
people to
rep.
come here. Huh?
They're union rep.
I mean, I don't know how to do it. I just,
Well, the idea of either a survey or, let's say, you guys create, what are the kind of questions that you want to get at? And again, let's say John and I, or, some entity would then, we could do those kind of, or send those out, gather the stuff, bring it back in, try and again, let's say redact all personal kinds of situations. But again, even if you're just looking at what are potential challenges you have with dealing with,
yeah,
So
and also,
I
I
think
think the other thing, the other,
challenges, things that you've faced, other kinds of things, I mean, it's the story, right? But-
and again, this is looking again at the effectiveness of these committees, looking at BCCs.
Right.
And looking at the way that they're structured and the way that they're supposed to operate versus the way that they're actually operating. I think some of the things that Alder Skidmore brought up about information that he was given not being complete and the degree to which, like, how is that possible? That we have alders who feel like they can't get accurate, or I shouldn't put words in his mouth, but he just felt like, or from what I understood from what he was saying, is that there can be challenges for alders getting information from staff, from committees also, and the way that that information is presented. And if you're on a committee and you're an alder and you're in one of these committees, let's just say it's a committee that's heavily dependent on staff input, and the information that you're being given is not as conclusive or is not as, and I think it'd be interesting, I don't know how you would get at that, but I think it's interesting.
Look,
But I could give you a really old example, is when I was an alder, I was told by a city staff person that they were told they were not allowed to make copies for me for the meeting. Like, it went that far, that they were like, we can't do that, we've been told we can't do that. So then I had to go to the council staff, have them make the copies, and have them bring them over to the committee, so it was available for the committee. Like, it does go both ways.
Yeah.
And we've been told, and alders have been told they're not allowed to talk to certain staff too.
staff
mean-
have been told they're not allowed to talk to alders.
Staff have been told they're not allowed to talk to alders.
So
It's-
I
Is that the rule? Is that the rule though?
I think the issue here.
So
but
which
like
staff, which staff are not allowed? Which ones? How do we designate it? Is that designated somewhere? Do they have little things on their?
There were hats.
They wear hats.
Well, I mean, I think you have some department heads who want to sort of, it's not necessarily control access, but sort of focus the work of their people, right? And if they're getting 20 questions asked of them versus kind of going through a process where that can be handled correctly. Again, I think.
That could be one explanation.
Yes.
Okay, but I think the issue is, and Justice, I totally trust your ability to extract from what you heard, what you perceive to be just bad behavior, and what you perceive to be, that could be enabled by a certain structure. And I think one lack in our structure is like no accountability for the behavior of alders. Like, we don't have any work rules, there's no one who can, I mean, it's just the electorate or the, circuit court that can get us taken out of office, right? I mean, even if we're convicted of a felony, I don't know, can we still serve? I don't know. But anyway, there is really no accountability for alder behavior in our system, and I don't know if we want to make rules for ourselves to do that. We probably should.
Well, that would be under the other subcommittee.
Right. But anyway, I think that the structural thing going on here, and I don't know if we ever resolve it, and I think it has to do with just the quality of leadership in the council and the quality of leadership in the administration, is the management authority of the mayor's office and the policy oversight of the council. And when the outcomes the city is producing through its organizational structure is straying farther and farther away from the stated policies of the city that the council has adopted, that the council wants to see enacted, then you get a situation where individual alders are like, well, we need to rein this in because they're not doing things according to policy. And when they start thinking that they can be little managers themselves. And so structurally, if we could come up with a way that the oversight actually works as a corrective, so you don't have, like, council as a whole oversight works as a potential corrective to how things are being implemented, and there's agreement around that, then I think the likelihood of alders acting like little, managers decreases. Because is what I see as the crux of the frustration, which leads to bad behavior.
Sir, you had something to say?
I was just gonna ask whether when you first started talking, I thought your point was a little broader in that there's just kind of an inherent awkwardness about asking staff to come to, the political leaders and identify problems, even if they're not like the egregious
Yeah.
abuses,
Yeah.
just like.
That's right,
Yeah.
because a lot of, that's what I'm saying, the majority,
Yeah.
first of all, and how many people work for the city of Madison, roughly?
3,000.
So I talked to 7, so like, it's just, I'm not, this is the thing. So it's
Right.
like, I'm not suggesting that this is like, all I'm saying is that there's big things here. First of all, as it pertains to this, one of the things that we talked about here is about the role of staff, like the demand on staff time, right? So we've talked about that, and so it'd be interesting to hear from them. But I think just a larger thing is that we are talking about the structure of our boards, commissions, and committees, which largely intersect or involve city staff, and we have not talked to any city staff. We have not asked them. We have not sent any word out. Has there been an email? Does the staff even know that this is going on? Because some of them, I'm finding out, don't. And I think, if they even knew that there was an opportunity to come down and talk to these subcommittees about some of these things, I think some of the more brazen ones would probably do so.
Or maybe their supervisors would be able to speak on their behalf.
Or maybe the supervisors not allow them to, and then I would want to hear about that too. But anyway, but the but no, but the thing is, I just feel like it's a major omission. If the staff has been something that the staffing has been a huge component of everything that we've identified, and the way that staffing is, and the way that staff intersect or are involved with these committees, commissions, and boards, that we have not discussed anything with them. I just feel like it's a major omission for the report, and that's all. And so I feel like even if it is just a survey, or even if it is a survey, and then like we did with the mayoral survey, saying we will be available if you would like to come talk to us. Here are some times, and you can just come down and then, as our distinguished guest from the office of Carl Van Lith suggested, if we had a structured set of questions, so we're not just, I'm not going to just meander and like pick, cherry pick, but we're saying, all right, so these are some questions that we think would lift up a certain number of things, and then we said, all right, so like if you're interested in coming down and talking to us, we do have some questions that we would love to hear from you if you're involved in these committees. And that's all, and it can be pretty general, but I do think we should have something where we tried, even if it's just a survey, even if it's
There's
just.
nothing wrong with asking them to come and talk, like we have with the public, but I think this could be part of our phase 2, where we have the public engagement, we also have the staff engagement portion of that, where we
Well, that's a
invite
good
them to
point.
come and address some specific questions if they choose to. I don't think we can make them come,
That's a good point.
but I think, we haven't talked to the public yet either. I mean, there's
Yeah.
public comment time, but we haven't.
But we
really
have
had an open
engaged
house.
the people who have been on committees.
Direct-
We have asked the
yeah.
public in the sense that they are involved with the committees. We
Right,
have gotten their
right.
input, and we did give them an opportunity to share.
Yeah.
Right.
We have not done that with our city staff yet.
No.
And I just think that that's something that we should do.
Yeah, and I
for
would
this.
say, in the what, April, May range, somewhere in there, that would be an appropriate thing to do.
So how do-
Unless
because-
you want to do it before.
That
So
is
what's the answer?
a limited number of people, and we know who they are. That's a discrete group of people, right?
When you say limited number, you're talking about all staff?
Staff who serve, who support committees.
So as in their.
In some capacity, because it's, I don't think it's ubiquitous. I think it's something it really depends on the office, it really depends on the committee. And I think
No, but what I'm saying, like, we can go through the committees and say who staffs this and which of the department people are usually there.
Yeah, formal staff.
Right.
But I mean,
It's not 3,000 people.
I'd be surprised if alders
All
don't
I'm saying
approach
is
staff
my
that
seven
don't,
doesn't.
who don't staff committees also.
Right.
Is that part
That's
of
what
what
I
you're
was trying
talking
to
about?
understand, because my guess is probably the people that you've talked to aren't necessarily the structural staff to these commissions.
There's city staff in many different places.
But,
Mhm.
and this is what I was
No
saying
knowledge.
early on, is that when you talk about staffing a commission, there's the people who go there and take the minutes and produce the agendas, but then you might have staff from 6 different departments that have to show up on a particular issue to give feedback from engineering, police, planning, whatever it may be. And those are all people that are interacting with these boards, commissions, and committees on a constant basis. So you might have, at any given meeting, you might have 4 to 6 staff.
Yeah.
But we discussed this in terms of equity in the committees, because the question is, can any committee ask any staff anything? I feel like the staff have to show up. If a committee on widgets is like, you know what, I want to talk to these folks, do they have to show up? Is there any way that the committee can actually require them to be there? And I would say that the likelihood that that committee is one of our executive or legislative committees is probably going to determine whether or not staff feel compelled to be at that thing. So,
Right.
Plan Commission, Parks,
Finance.
and then the funding ones, the ones that do any type of funding allocation. So, like those things, economic development, I would say, dealing with the TIF stuff, and then your CDBG, CDD related ones, DPCED in general, the ones that they're involved in, I think there's heavy staff involvement, right? And
Disproportionate from any other
right,
department in the
Parks
city.
Commission, Anyway, engineering, I think, for public work, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. So how do we, what are our thoughts? I mean, if we say through the boards, commissions, and committees, a huge component we identified was the relationship of staffing on these things. And then and by the way, we did not talk to any staff. I'm fine with that too. I just feel like that's a huge weakness in the report that we're gonna do for this thing. So that's why I think we should figure out a way to do that, even if it's, I don't know, there's no.
I think the best place to start is the survey, and if you don't like what you get there, meaning there's not enough information or there's a low response, then, or either way, you could include in that next phase when we're engaging the public. But I think the easiest place to start is a survey with defined questions that people can submit anonymously, and suggest to them that you don't include specific examples so we can figure it out.
They submitted anonymously.
Well, you thought-
Your anonymous email.
No, when you click on like a Survey
Survey
Monkey,
Monkey.
the Survey Monkey link, you don't actually need to write your name.
Okay, right.
Complete option.
I always wonder about the validity of those things, but okay. Fair enough. Okay,
But it's
so,
just like you said, it's an attempt for us to, get a fuller picture of what folks that.
so how are we gonna do this? So
The
who's gonna,
administrators should also have a pretty good idea of
so if
how
I put together,
staff time is being used.
if the two of us put together a draft of what the survey will be, and then we can send it out to this subcommittee, how do people feel about that? By way of, a motion
Yes.
suggesting that we do that.
Yeah, I don't think we need a motion.
Okay,
We
we don't
just
need
do
one?
it.
Yeah, we can do it.
Let's do it, then we're gonna do that, and then we'll also do the thing that John suggested, which is when we will figure out a way to deliberately invite staff
Yeah.
to come to the, and we'll put that at the bottom of the survey, if they would like to discuss anything with us. I don't know.
Well, we can work with Carl in terms of, because we did that exact same thing with the
Yeah.
government official surveys,
Right.
had a box in the bottom, and that was a survey monkey.
Right, yeah. we can- So if
And
you
so
guys come up with
this
questions, we can support.
Survey will go to all 3,000 city employees, or to those who we can identify as staff, or are we going to send it to department heads and other
I
supervisors?
think what I would do, and again, this is you guys to sort of determine, but if you think about commissions, I think are really the kind of key ones that have impact on some of the things that Rebecca, I think, was talking about in terms of budget impacts and other, those are potentially are the ways where if there's influence or if there might be challenges or other kinds of things, might be probably under those commission headings rather than all staff interactions. But that's just my thought.
Okay.
You guys could determine that. And
So
that
if
would be a
we'll
limited
put
number.
out, what we'll do is we'll send out the draft structure to the subcommittee, and then we'll see how folks feel about it. And if we can get just some general, if we can agree that that looks good, we'll get it to Carl.
We can't agree over email, but you
Okay.
can send back,
Right.
you can send back comments to us about changes you want to make. And if there are conflicts, then it may be that we have to schedule another meeting to actually
talk about it.
resolve those.
Right.
If there aren't conflicts, then we could go ahead and finalize.
We good with that? Thank you all again. That's something that I should have, we should have thought about way earlier.
Who was it going to? I'm sorry, I just missed that piece.
Carl. Well, it's gonna go first. It will go to the subcommittee, who will look at it.
Ultimately, I
The
thought Carl
survey,
was
who's-
saying,
No, I was saying that, yeah, I think you should determine who do you want to send it to in terms of staff, because going to 3,000 staff won't make
No.
much sense to a machine operator in the streets, you know, if they're not really staffing the thing. But I think potentially the staff who do commissions, you know, again, that have budgetary impact, ways that legal things are there, or policy pieces, those are probably the more important people to get feedback from, or the ones who would potentially give you some feedback in terms of interactions or other things that may be challenging.
Okay.
Is there enough of a buffer for people to feel like they're not gonna be singled out immediately if you narrow it that close? Because one of the things about keeping it wider is
Yeah.
even if it may not apply to everybody in the same way, some people
Right.
might feel like, okay, I won't be obviously identified the minute I,
Yeah.
I think that's a great point. What about just sending it to all of them and just asking, are you involved, or do you serve on any committee, or do you interact with any, what is the nature of, I don't know.
think of a question, maybe some kind of question that isn't too specific about your role, and then, because I would just worry, a lot of people would be like, nope.
Yeah, I'm not gonna get.
And I don't think you're gonna get a whole lot of, right, I agree. And it doesn't have to, and it's not, we're not gonna ask which ones. We're not.
Right,
We're just
right.
gonna ask questions about the structural questions. Are there challenges, generally speaking, that you see with, you know, the way that they're, everything that we have down here?
And ask them for ideas about,
Other ways to make it better.
Yeah, maybe
If you have
ways to
any
make it
suggestions that you think that the committee structure or processes could be improved,
Yeah.
what would they be?
yeah.
Based on your interaction with them, and that's all. I mean, we don't have to, you know, again, we're not trying to, I promise this is not a witch hunt. We're not trying to, all we're trying to do is we're soliciting the professionals that work in the city of Madison for their insight and professional opinions about the way that the committees, commissions, and boards that they support operate, that's all. And just, you know, so that we did it.
And it would be one way to try to get a number of how many of the 3,000 people actually interact with the boards, commissions, and committees.
Yep,
Because we don't know that.
because you could even have
I could
a,
just say,
how
do you?
occasionally, or, you know, give them
Yeah.
some range of how many times a year you interact with, or some kind of questions like that, that person could click, because they could have all this feedback, and then they could choose their level of interaction somehow.
or they could just check the box no and be done with the survey.
Right.
Right,
yeah,
if
right.
no, you're still welcome to come out and be public.
And then you'll get 3,000 no's because they don't want to fill out the rest of the survey.
That would
So be it.
amazing if you
You
could-
get the highly motivated answers.
That's fine, as long, but I feel like we should at least ask.
Yeah.
We should solicit their feedback, that's all.
Because that would be an interesting data point to know if we can get that. Because that would talk a lot about how much staff time it takes.
Mm.
You get 2,000 people that have to interact with the boards, commissions, and committees.
Interesting. Right, because that was one of the, generally speaking, we identified this, is that it is a tremendous lift in terms of the city staff time.
Yeah.
What is that lift? Ballpark, who knows? So we could get some of that. How do we feel about this?
Excellent.
Sure, great.
Okay, good. Last agenda, I know we're over, and I do apologize, I've been apologizing a lot today. Just to make sure, discussion of the schedule for preparation of subcommittee reports of the task force. This is, I think, the last thing, and I think most of it we have already, right? I think the only thing we would need right now is this last piece in terms of staff participation, and I think then we are done, but I don't think that's gonna stop us from moving forward with what we got.
No, I plan to start writing that. I hope to have a draft done before Mike gets back from vacation.
Sounds
I
good.
feel like there's a tiny bit more work around, that we've talked about it in different ways, and we've kind of weaseled out from actually making a decision, but I think we might be able to recommend some committee consolidations and committee elimination. I think there's some low-hanging fruit there. I think your document have proposed that, I don't know if you're specifically proposed
I tried to stay out of the
elimination,
out of
but maybe
elimination.
Brenda, you didn't send this
I
in.
feel like what we should do though is we should recommend that
At
the
least
task force
point out,
does it.
point out what they might be.
Identify
Right,
some
instead
things
of
that
just
may
saying,
be for
"Ah, we couldn't
consideration, instead of
decide."
recommending, we're just saying that we identified these things as potentially being up for consideration of elimination.
I mean, the city attorney's office.
Something
That sounds like a
that.
recommendation.
Why don't we just say the city attorney's office did, provided us with some recommendations?
Yeah, let's
We
do
should-
that.
we-
So
we
maybe
should-
then
we
just
should
don't
look at
shy
that.
away from adding that in the report.
And say that they can keep doing more of that.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, but how do you guys feel? Do you feel like that's thorough? I thought what the idea was that
It's
we
not
were.
thorough, no.
So I mean, I just feel like we need to get, if we're gonna hit the March 12th, if we're gonna have a draft of this in time for us to meet again to review it and then make necessary adjustments at that point in order to get this thing ready for presentation on March 12th, it may not be the worst idea to ask the task force to take this on.
Yeah.
And we
that's
could come in
fine.
there with a number of
Yeah.
ideas with that and lead that discussion.
Yeah.
And my feeling is that we'll never finish within a year and a
Right.
half or 2 years if we actually take the time to learn what each of these are supposed to do, what they are doing, and where they should fit in the organizational structure.
We all gotta go serve on them for
Yeah,
years.
yeah. I mean, it would be like interviews and talking. I mean, I just don't think we're the right body to do it, and that's something that, I mean, Orange could be part of that, and I think
I agree.
the mother
Yeah.
committees, if we make them, should be part of that, and that it's something that the city staff in general should be doing. is make it
And I think if we change, if we tinker that whole idea of a performance review or a review of what they're doing, et cetera,
Yeah.
that might do
Yeah.
this for itself, right?
Yeah,
So
right.
like if that was something that we're
In
lifting
a year
up.
after the reorganization was done, then they could make recommendations about who should be changed into a task force and who should be eliminated.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you all for your time. At this time, I would entertain a motion to adjourn this
I
subcommittee.
move to adjourn.
Second,
Have a second. Is there any further discussion?
Wait, you know what? Are we setting another meeting?
I don't think we need to right now. Does anyone think we need to at this point?
do we need to put our
When does Mike get
seal of
back from,
approval on the report?
That's what I was thinking. Do we need to have a meeting to review the report before it goes to the?
Yeah, we do. When does Mike get back?
He's back on the 17th. But I would say the
And
other
the-
council subcommittee is going to meet around March 1st to review their report. I think that's probably a good timeline.
Okay, how do people feel about that? So should we look at our calendars right now and make that?
Yeah,
All right.
since it's us plus Maggie.
And March 1st is a Friday.
Yeah.
How do people feel about that Wednesday?
The February
Additional for-
27th?
Or the morning? Yeah, the morning of Wednesday is better for me. What do you guys got?
I got NRT meeting that morning, speaking of NRT.
What about that last week in February?
Actually, I could do noon,
Where we're talking about? the
on Wednesday, the
27th?
27th.
John?
Yeah, I could do, we could start a little bit earlier.
I could do 11 or 11:30.
11 on the 27th?
Yeah.
Sir? Okay, 11 o'clock in the AM on February 27th, 2019. We will meet again to look at the draft report. This time, any further discussion on the motion to adjourn? Hearing none. Thank you again to everybody who came, to Brenda for taping this, and to all of our city staff and public servants who
Thanks.
support these committees.
Thank you.